What if I told you that the father of Europe, the great unifier and emperor who inspired the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, never really existed in the way we imagine him? Prepare to demystify one of the greatest icons of Western history and discover a brutal secret that the Church itself chose to hide. The truth is that the man behind the imperial crown was not only a military genius and a beacon of culture in dark times. He was a paradox, a ruthless conqueror whose faith was as deep as his fist was heavy. In an era of post-Roman chaos, where Europe was a map torn apart by barbarian tribes and ephemeral kingdoms, one man had the audacity to dream of an empire. But what was the true cost of that dream? Did he have to become a bloodthirsty tyrant to become the great builder? And what you're about to see in just a few minutes is the true, untold story of how one man's brutality shaped the continent we inhabit today, revealing why perhaps the history you know about the Middle Ages is fundamentally wrong. The future of Europe depended on one man, and his method of unification would be as glorious as it was shocking. The curtain rises on a stage of rubble, not of stone and mortar, but of ideas and structures. Imagine Western Europe in the 8th century, not as we know it today, with its well-defined nations and drawn borders. Forget the glorious empires and disciplined legions of yesteryear. That Roman grandeur had crumbled like sand through your fingers, leaving behind a vast vacuum filled with fragments of power, tribes in constant movement, and a fog of uncertainty that covered the continent like a heavy blanket. What remained was a land in turmoil, a melting pot of Germanic cultures, Latin remnants, and the rising influence of a church that paradoxically was both a beacon of hope and a battlefield in its own right. Cities, once vibrant centers of commerce and culture, were shrinking, their once paved streets overgrown with weeds, their grand buildings in ruins, serving as homes for the poor or hideouts for bandits. Roman infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, communication systems was in decline, if not completely destroyed. Trade had declined dramatically, coins were becoming increasingly rare, and the concept of a centralized economy was almost a distant memory. Central authority had collapsed. There was no emperor in Rome to lay down laws or marshal armies to protect the borders. In their place arose barbarian kingdoms, often short-lived, ruled by warlords whose domains were as vast as their swords could reach, and as enduring as their ability to retain the loyalty of their warriors. The Visigoths dominated the Iberian Peninsula, the Lombards settled in Italy, the Angles and Saxons were shaping the future England, and the Franks, well, the Franks were building something in the heart of Gaul, albeit in a rudimentary and fragile form. These were the so-called Dark Ages, a term that, although many historians now consider simplistic and even pejorative, still conjures up images of a period of intellectual decline, political instability, and a relative obscurity of classical knowledge. Latin, once the lingua franca of the empire, was fragmenting into dialects that would give rise to the Romance languages. Knowledge, which was previously disseminated in large libraries and academies, now took refuge in isolated monasteries, guarded by monks who were often the only ones who could read and write in a largely illiterate society. In this landscape of disorder, fear was a constant companion. Sporadic invasions by non-Christian peoples, such as the Avars from the east or the Muslims from the south, added an extra layer of insecurity. Life was brutally short and unpredictable. Justice was often a matter of brute force or tribal loyalties. There was no unified legal system or police force to maintain order. It was a world where survival depended on the strength of the group, the protection of a local leader, and the ability to adapt quickly to change. But even amid the chaos, a force was beginning to consolidate itself, the Catholic Church. Although it was also fragmented and subject to local pressures, it was the only institution that had survived the Roman collapse more or less intact. Its bishops and abbots were often the only figures of authority capable of offering some form of social order, charity, and, above all, spiritual hope. It was the guardian of the faith, but also of culture, education, and a significant part of the wealth of the time. The Church dreamed of a unified Christian Europe, But this vision seemed delusional in the midst of so much disunity and violence. It was in this crucible of instability, fragmentation, and a quiet search for order and meaning that a figure would emerge who would, for a brief and glorious period, reverse the course of history and lay the foundations for a new Europe. But how? How could a single man, born into a kingdom still in formation, manage to stitch together the patches of a torn continent? The answer begins with the rise of one family, a clan of pragmatic and cunning leaders who quietly plotted their rise to power as the Merovingian world reeled on its last legs. The story of the future Emperor Charlemagne does not begin with him, but with the foundations that were patiently laid by his ancestors, amidst the mists of legend and the harsh facts that marked the reign of the Franks. To understand the greatness of Charlemagne, one must first understand the ground he walked on, the political and military seedbed left by the Merovingian dynasty, and most crucially, the silent and relentless rise of the stewards of the palace, the true driving force behind the throne he would one day inherit. The Merovingians, descendants of Clovis I, were the legendary kings of the Franks, whose power extended over much of Gaul. Their names, like Clovis, echoed with the aura of warriors who unified the Frankish tribes under a single crown and embraced Nicene Christianity, a shrewd move that secured them the support of the Church of Rome and set them apart from other Germanic peoples who professed Arianism. For centuries, the Merovingians were the rulers, their long hair a symbol of their royalty and mystical power. But like many great dynasties, they became, over time, more symbolic than effective figures. We have entered the period of the rois fainéants, the lazy kings, or kings who do nothing. The image that comes to us is that of monarchs who spent their days in pleasure, leaving the reins of government in the hands of their main administrators, the palace stewards, majordomos. They were the ones who really ruled, who led the armies, who negotiated treaties, and who managed the vast royal estate. It was a bizarre paradox. Kings with the title and pomp, but without the power, and stewards with all the power, but without the title. Against this backdrop of Merovingian decline, one family in particular began to rise to prominence: the Pippinids, direct ancestors of Charlemagne. It began with Pepin of Herstal, a steward of the Palace of Austrasia, one of the divisions of the Frankish kingdom, who managed to unify the stewardship positions throughout Gaul. He laid the foundation for his family to become the dominant force in the kingdom. But it was his illegitimate son, Charles Martel, who solidified Pippinid power for good. Charles Martel is a legendary figure in his own right, known as the Hammer for his unparalleled military prowess. His greatest glory came at the Battle of Poitiers in 732 AD, where he halted the Muslim advance into Western Europe, an achievement that the Church and later history would come to extol as crucial to the preservation of Christianity. This event not only gave him immense prestige, but also elevated him to a status of savior of Europe, cementing the idea that royal power was no longer a matter of sacred lineage, but of military and governmental ability. Charles Martel, although he never assumed the title of king, ruled as a de facto monarch. He commanded the respect of the nobles, the fear of his enemies, and the growing support of the Church, which saw in the Pippinids a force capable of bringing order and protection. Upon his death, he divided his power between his sons, Carloman and Pepin the Short. Carloman unexpectedly renounced power and retired to a monastery, leaving Pepin the Short as the sole effective ruler of the Franks. Pepin the Short was a man of vision and ambition. He saw the perfect opportunity to formalize the power that his family had held for generations. In 751 AD, with the blessing of Pope Zachary I, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, a puppet with no real power. Childeric was tonsured. His long hair, a symbol of his power, was cut off, stripped of his royal dignity, and sent to a monastery. Pepin the Short was then crowned king of the Franks, beginning the new dynasty that would come to be known as the Carolingians, a name that echoed the glory of Charles Martel. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in Frankish history, the crown had been transferred from an old dynasty to a new one, based not on traditional lineage, but on the ability to rule and, crucially, on the support of the church. Pepin the Short did not merely rule. He legitimized his family in a way that his predecessors had not dared. He cemented an alliance with the papacy, defending Rome against the Lombards and giving the church lands, the donation of Pepin, that would form the future papal states. He paved the way for the consolidation of even greater power. He was the father of a boy who would soon inherit not just a kingdom, but a vision of empire that would far surpass the dreams of his ancestors. The stage was set. The old order had fallen, and the pillars of a new one were firmly in place. What would this new king do with such a legacy? The answer would come with the clash of swords and the gleam of the imperial crown. The veil of history lifts over the birth of Charles, an event that, at the time, did not have the aura of predestination that later centuries would confer upon it. The truth is that the details of his childhood are shrouded in a haze of uncertainty, a common characteristic of many medieval figures. There is no exact record of his birth date, with historians generally placing it at 742 AD. What we do know for sure is that he came into the world at a time of seismic transition, the son of a man who was about to overthrow one dynasty and build the foundations of a new one. Charles was the son of Pepin the Short, who at the time of his birth was still only the steward of the palace, the force behind the Merovingian king, Childeric III. His mother was Bertrada of Laon, a woman of remarkable intelligence and influence, who would play a significant role in the lives of her children and in the politics of the kingdom. He was not an only child. She had a younger brother, Charlemagne, and several sisters, whose fates would intertwine with hers in complex and sometimes tragic ways. Charles's childhood was not marked by excessive luxury, although he lived at the court of a man who held de facto power. The Frankish lifestyle was more rustic and martial than that of the Byzantine or Muslim courts of the time. Growing up meant being exposed to military life from an early age. The sons of Frankish nobles learned to ride, handle weapons, hunt, and practice the arts of war from an early age. There were no formal schools or extensive literary education, as in classical societies. Learning was practical, focused on land management and, above all, military leadership. Imagine the young Charles, probably a tall and robust boy for his age, watching his father, Pepin. He would witness the political maneuvering that would lead to the deposition of the Merovingians, the coronation of Pepin as king, and the strategic alliance with the papacy. He would see armies being assembled, battle strategies being discussed, ambassadors from distant kingdoms arriving at court. Life at Pepin's court was a crash course in governance and power, a school of statecraft, where practical experience was worth more than any treaty. The relationship with his father was crucial. Pepin the Short was not only a cunning warrior, but also a skilled diplomat. He consolidated the Frankish kingdom, expanded its borders, and, crucially, established the Carolingian dynasty with papal blessing. Charles, alongside his brother Charlemagne, was being groomed to take up the mantle. They were the heirs to an audacious political project, born to be kings in a world that was still being formed. Although little is known about the intimate details of Charlemagne's personality in his youth, it is plausible to infer that he absorbed his father's lessons: the importance of military strength to maintain power, the need for strategic alliances, especially with the church, and the vision of a strong and united Frankish kingdom. He would also have witnessed the fragility of alliances and the ambition that permeated the courts. Charlemagne's youth, then, was the crucible in which the future emperor was forged. Far from the myths and legends that would surround him later, he was a pragmatic young man, trained for war and government, immersed in an environment where power was won and maintained by sword and cunning. These formative years, though sparsely recorded, are crucial to understanding the man who would become the greatest leader of his time. He was not a king by divine right from birth, but rather forged by the brutal realities of medieval politics and warfare. And the seed of ambition, Or perhaps destiny was already beginning to sprout in his heart, preparing him for the immense challenges that awaited him on the Frankish throne. What course would that destiny take, especially with the shadow of a competing brother looming over him? The scene is set in 768 AD. The roar of cheers fills the air, mingling with the clang of weapons and cries of loyalty. Pepin the Short, the king who dared to overthrow a dynasty and found a new one, has died. His death, though expected for a man of his age and with the responsibilities he bore, casts a shadow of uncertainty over the future of the Frankish kingdom. According to Frankish tradition, the kingdom was to be divided between his two sons, Charles and Carloman. This practice, common among the Franks who viewed the kingdom as the personal property of the ruler, was both a cultural legacy and a recipe for instability. And for the two young heirs, this division would be both an opportunity and a source of bitter rivalry. Charles the Elder received the western and northern parts of the kingdom, including the coastal regions of Gaul and Aquitaine. Carloman, in turn, took the eastern and southern lands, including Austrasia and Alemannia. At first glance, it seemed like an even split, but geography and local alliances would soon reveal underlying tensions. The tension between the brothers was palpable, a dark cloud hanging over the power negotiations. Although they were united by blood, their personalities were distinct. Carlos, more pragmatic, ambitious, and a natural leader. Carloman, perhaps more reserved or perhaps just less inclined to give in to his older brother. The first years of their joint reign were marked by a difficult coexistence. The rivalry was not only political, but also personal. Contemporary sources suggest a growing animosity, fueled by ambitious advisors and nobles who saw in the royal discord an opportunity to increase their own power. One of the most obvious points of friction was the revolt in Aquitaine. While Charles marched to suppress the rebels, Carloman, whose territory bordered the conflicting region, refused to provide military support, claiming that the revolt was the responsibility of Charles's domain. This episode not only highlighted the lack of cooperation, but deepened mutual distrust. It was a dangerous game of chess, where every move could tip the balance of power. Their mother, Queen Mother Bertrada, played a crucial role in this period of tension. As a true political matriarch, she tried desperately to mediate the dispute between her sons. Her influence extended to matrimonial diplomacy. She arranged for Charles to marry the daughter of King Desiderius of the Lombards, in an attempt to seal a vital alliance and isolate Carloman. However, this alliance was fragile, and soon Charles, for political and perhaps personal reasons, repudiated his Lombard wife, sending her back to her father's court. This act angered not only Desiderius, but also Bertrada herself, who had invested so much in this union. The repudiation demonstrated Charles's independence and determination to chart his own course, without tying himself to alliances that did not serve his long-term interests. Fate, or destiny, intervened in a way that would forever change the course of Frankish history. In 771 AD, just 3 years after his father's death, and in the midst of a bitter rivalry with Charles, Carloman died suddenly. The cause of his death is uncertain. There is speculation that he died suddenly. But in a period of such intrigue, the shadow of suspicion always hangs over such convenient events. Whatever the cause, his death was a turning point. With Carloman's death, his nobles and advisors, fearing the absorption of their territories by Charles, rushed to support Carloman's young sons as heirs. Carloman's widow Gerberga, seeking protection for her sons and perhaps for herself, fled with them to the court of Desiderius, king of the Lombards, who already had plenty of reason to hate Charles. This flight to Lombardy would be a spark for the next great conflict, but Charles acted swiftly and decisively. Without hesitation, he proclaimed himself sole ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom, ignoring the demands of his young nephews. He unified the lands divided by his father, consolidating a power that no Frankish monarch had held for centuries. It was a bold, perhaps ruthless move, but it was crucial to what was to come. From that moment on, there would be no more significant, Internal divisions. The Frankish kingdom was united under the strong hand of a single man. Western Europe was about to witness the rise of a new giant, a leader who, with sword and cross, would build an empire from the ashes of the past. The stage for greatness was set, but the way would be paved with blood and fire. With the Frankish kingdom unified under his unchallenged rule, Charlemagne wasted no time. Internal peace was merely the prelude to a much grander project, the expansion and unification of Western Europe, not through diplomacy, but through the might of his legions. His reign would be defined by a nearly uninterrupted series of military campaigns, each carefully planned to consolidate his power, Christianize the pagans, and expand the frontiers of what would come to be known as the Carolingian Empire. It was an audacious vision, fueled by the ambition of a man who seemed to know no bounds, and by the belief that his mission was divine. Charlemagne's first great military adventure took him into the heart of Italy, against the kingdom of the Lombards. This was not just a territorial conflict, but a clash of wills and a question of honor. The Lombard king Desiderius had taken in Gerberga and the sons of Carloman, Charlemagne's nephews, and was putting pressure on the papacy, threatening the Papal States, which Pepin the Short had promised to protect. Pope Adrian III, feeling cornered, appealed to the Frankish king for help. Charlemagne answered the call in 773 AD, leading a massive army across the Alps, an impressive logistical feat for the time. The mountain passes were a challenge, but Charles's determination was unwavering. The siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital, lasted for months, a testament to Desiderius's tenacity and Charles's persistence. While Pavia held out, Charles traveled to Rome at Easter 774 AD, where he reaffirmed the alliance with the Pope and the donation of Pepin, further cementing the link between Frankish power and the Church. Eventually, Pavia fell. Desiderius was deposed and exiled, and Charlemagne assumed the title of King of the Lombards in 774 AD, annexing the kingdom to his Frankish crown. Central Italy was now under his control, a giant step towards European hegemony. While Italy was being conquered, a more persistent and entrenched threat lay in wait to the northeast, the Saxons. This would be the longest and most brutal of all his campaigns, a war that would last for more than 30 years, from 772 to 804 AD, and that would combine territorial conquest with forced religious conversion. The Saxons were a fiercely independent pagan Germanic people who inhabited the forests and marshes between the Rhine and the Elbe. Their marauding raids into Frankish lands were a constant headache, and their refusal to accept Christianity was a direct affront to Charlemagne's vision of a unified Christian Europe. The war against the Saxons was a series of punitive campaigns, characterized by massacres, destruction of pagan holy sites, such as Irminsul, mass deportations, and forced Christianization. Charlemagne imposed draconian laws, including the death penalty for those who refused to be baptized or practiced pagan rites. The most infamous episode was the massacre of Verdun in 782 AD, where, following a Saxon revolt, Charlemagne ordered the execution of some 4,500 Saxon prisoners. This brutality, shocking even by medieval standards, was intended to break Saxon resistance once and for all. The resistance, led by figures such as Widukind, was relentless, but Frankish persistence and military superiority eventually prevailed. The annexation and Christianization of Saxony was a landmark, expanding Frankish rule deep into the east and establishing a new frontier for Western Christendom. But Charlemagne's gaze was not limited to the east and south. South of the Pyrenees, on the Iberian Peninsula, the Caliphate of Córdoba, a sophisticated and powerful Muslim empire, flourished. In 778 AD, Charlemagne launched a campaign against the Moors in response to an invitation from dissident Muslim leaders. The expedition, however, failed to achieve its main objectives. The siege of Saragossa failed, and the Frankish forces were forced to retreat. It was during this retreat, in the Pyrenees Mountains, that the legendary disaster of the Battle of Roncesvalles occurred. Although a defeat for the Franks, The death of Roland and his rearguard would become one of the greatest medieval epics, the Song of Roland, a tale of Christian heroism and sacrifice against the infidel enemy. Although a military setback, this campaign established a Spanish March, a buffer zone south of the Pyrenees that was vital to the security of his borders. To the east, another people threatened the Frankish frontiers, the Avars. These semi-nomadic people, originally from the steppes of Central Asia, had established a vast and rich ring, circular fortification, in Pannonia, modern Hungary, amassing treasures from centuries of plundering. From 791 to 796 AD, Charlemagne and his son Pepin led decisive campaigns against the Avars. The campaigns were brutally effective, dismantling the Avar ring and plundering a huge amount of treasure, which Charlemagne used to finance his reforms and construction. The defeat of the Avars removed a significant threat to the empire's eastern borders and opened up new trade routes. Charlemagne's campaigns were not just acts of conquest, but of profound transformation. Each victory expanded not only his territory but also the sphere of influence of Christianity and Frankish culture. His armies, though made up of drafted nobles and peasants, were remarkably effective, led by a king who was as much a military strategist as a courageous warrior. With each new land he annexed, he established a system of administration, appointed counts and dukes, and imposed Frankish law. The result of this frenetic military expansion was the creation of a vast empire, a conglomeration of peoples and cultures under a single crown, the largest since the fall of Rome. But how did one hold together such an immense and diverse domain? The answer lay not only in the sword, but also in the power of another force, the cross. The history of the Saxon Wars, which lasted for more than 30 years, from 772 to 804 AD, is a dark and, at the same time, fundamental chapter for understanding the nature of Charlemagne's power and the consolidation of the Carolingian Empire. Far from the idealized image of a peaceful unifier, Charlemagne was a ruthless leader, and his campaign against the Saxons is the clearest testimony to this brutality. This conflict was not just a war of territorial conquest. It was a war of cultural and religious annihilation, in which the sword of Charlemagne joined the cross of the Catholic Church to impose a new order on a people stubborn in their pagan traditions. The Saxons were a Germanic people who inhabited the lands between the Rhine and the Elbe, a region of dense forests, marshes, and scattered villages. They were fiercely independent, organized into tribes and clans with no central government, which made them difficult to conquer but also a constant threat to the Frankish borders with their raids for plunder. More than that, they were pagans. Their faith was rooted in animist cults, worship of sacred trees and Germanic deities, with the Irminsul, a pillar or tree of great religious importance, being the center of their spiritual identity. For Charlemagne, and for the Church, the existence of a pagan people so close to the borders of a Christian kingdom was unacceptable. The war began in 772 AD, with the destruction of Irminsul by Charlemagne. This symbolic act of desecrating a sacred place was a declaration of war not only against the Saxons, but against their own souls. For the Saxons, it was an outrage, a sacrilege that demanded revenge. For Charlemagne, it was the first step towards forced Christianization and subjugation. The Frankish campaigns were annual, almost ritualistic, campaigns of devastation and imposition. Charlemagne led his armies deep into Saxon territory, destroying villages, imprisoning warriors, and forcing mass conversions through baptism. With each campaign, he imposed draconian laws, the Saxon Capitularies, Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a series of decrees that criminalized pagan practices and made adherence to Christianity mandatory under penalty of death. Sacrificing. To pagan gods, cremating the dead, or even eating meat during Lent could all be punished by life. It was an attempt to eradicate not just religion, but Saxon culture itself. The Saxon resistance, led by charismatic figures such as Widukind, was tenacious and relentless. Widukind was a brilliant military leader, able to rally the scattered, tribes and launch guerrilla attacks against the Frankish forces, using his knowledge of the terrain. He was the embodiment of rebellion, a symbol of Saxon freedom against Frankish and Christian tyranny. His figure would become legendary, a hero of his people, even in defeat. The height of brutality came in 782 AD with the massacre of Verdun. Following a new Saxon revolt that resulted in the deaths of several Frankish nobles, Charlemagne, in an act of fury and calculated retribution, ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verdun. This event shocked even some of his contemporaries, and remains one of the most controversial points of his reign. The massacre was intended not only to punish, but to terrorize, to break the Saxon spirit once and for all, and to show that resistance would be met with the utmost violence. Even after Verdun, Saxon resistance continued for more than 2 decades, but the tide was turning. With each revolt, Charlemagne responded with greater ferocity. With mass deportation campaigns, relocating Saxon families to the interior of the Frankish kingdom, and settling Franks on Saxon lands in an attempt to dilute the cultural and political identity of the people. Finally, in 785 AD, Widukind, exhausted and without hope of victory, submitted to Charlemagne and accepted baptism on the guarantee of his life. His surrender was a fatal blow to Saxon resistance. Although forced conversion was superficial in many places, the imposition of Christianity and the annexation of Saxony were crucial to the formation of the Carolingian Empire. It expanded the Frankish frontiers far to the east, creating a vast area of influence and establishing a new frontier for Western Christianity. Charlemagne understood that religious unity was a fundamental pillar of the stability of his vast domain. Christianization, however brutally imposed, was intended to integrate the Saxons into the social and political structure of the empire, transforming enemies into subjects. The Saxon Wars are a stark reminder that the building of great empires, even those associated with cultural renaissances, is often paved with suffering and subjugation. The brutality of this campaign, however, paved the way for a unity that Charlemagne considered essential to the foundation of his empire. But what was the role of the church in this power equation? And how did the cross intertwine with the sword in his grand design? Charlemagne's reign cannot be understood without analyzing his symbiotic and intrinsic relationship with the Catholic Church. The sword and the cross, far from being opposing symbols, were 2 sides of the same coin in his imperial project. Charlemagne was not just a conqueror of lands. He saw himself as a protector and promoter of the Christian faith, a new Constantine, with the divine mission of unifying Europe under the banner of Christ and the authority of Rome. This alliance was not just convenient, it was fundamental to the legitimacy, structure, and expansion of his vast domain. Since the time of his father, Pepin the Short, the Carolingian dynasty had cultivated a close relationship with the papacy. Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king with papal blessing and defended Rome against the Lombards, donating lands that would become the papal states. Charlemagne inherited and expanded this policy. He saw the church not simply as a religious institution, but as an indispensable tool for the governance and social cohesion of his empire. The church, for its part, saw in Charlemagne a powerful defender, a champion of the faith capable of offering military protection against external enemies, such as the Lombards or the Muslims, and of imposing order and orthodoxy within his own domains. In a fragmented and violent Europe, the Pope needed a strong secular arm to protect his spiritual authority and his material goods. Charlemagne was that arm. Christianization, often by force, was a central pillar of their expansionist policy. As we saw in the Saxon Wars, conversion was not an option, but a requirement imposed by the conqueror. He overthrew pagan idols, baptized masses of people, and founded bishoprics and monasteries in newly conquered lands. These new religious centers served a dual purpose. They were outposts of the Christian faith, and at the same time, administrative and cultural centers of the empire. Monks and priests were sent to evangelize, but also to teach writing, organize the administration, and propagate Frankish culture. Charlemagne exercised unprecedented control over the church in his kingdom. He appointed bishops and abbots, often choosing men who were loyal to him and capable of fulfilling both religious and administrative functions. He presided over councils and synods, where he discussed not only matters of faith, but also the discipline of the clergy, education, and organization of the church. He saw himself as a priest-king, with the responsibility of guiding his people, not only politically but spiritually. This royal intrusion into ecclesiastical affairs was remarkable, but it was accepted by the church, which depended on his protection and patronage. Liturgical reform and the standardization of worship were other manifestations of this alliance. Charlemagne promoted the adoption of the Roman Rite throughout his empire, replacing local practices. He encouraged the copying of religious manuscripts, the education of the clergy, and the establishment of monastic and cathedral schools to ensure that doctrine was taught correctly and that there were literate men to administer both church and state. The Bible was revised and standardized during his reign, a massive effort that demonstrated his commitment to religious uniformity. Charlemagne's relationship with the papacy was one of respect, but also of a subtle but clear royal supremacy. Although he sought papal blessing for his actions and protected Rome, he did not see himself as a subordinate of the Pope, but as a partner, the more powerful partner. He controlled the appointment of bishops and was the protector in fact of the Pope. The imperial coronation in 800 AD, as we shall see, would be the culmination of this complex relationship, a moment of shared glory, but also a demonstration of royal power that some interpreted as superior to papal power. The alliance between Charlemagne's sword and the cross of the Catholic Church was the driving force behind the creation and maintenance of his vast empire. Religion provided divine legitimacy for his conquests, ideological cohesion for a multi-ethnic empire, and an administrative network of learned clergy. Military power provided the protection and resources for the church to flourish and expand its influence. Together, they shaped a new kind of Europe, one defined not just by kingdoms, but by a common faith. But what exactly was this empire that was being forged with so much blood and devotion? And how vast would it become? With each military campaign, with each new land subjugated, Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom grew in proportion and complexity, drawing on the map of Europe a new entity that, due to its vastness and ambition, recalled the ancient glory of Rome. It was not an empire by proclamation or dream, but a reality forged by the sword and tireless administration of its monarch. What emerged, even before his imperial coronation, was the Carolingian Empire, a territorial colossus that would unite under a single crown peoples and cultures as diverse as the Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Bavarians, and even the remnants of the Visigothic and Avar peoples. At its height, the Carolingian Empire was undoubtedly the largest and most powerful political entity in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Its borders were impressively extensive. In the west, it encompassed much of present-day France, Gaul, the heartland of the Frankish kingdom. In the south, it encompassed the kingdom of the Lombards in Italy, stretching as far as Rome and including the patrimony of St. Peter. In the east, it incorporated the vast and newly conquered lands of Saxony, extending as far as the Elbe, and extended through Bavaria and the Pannonian regions, after the defeat of the Avars, touching the borders of the Byzantine Empire and the Slavic peoples. In the northeast, it included what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, and in the southwest, the Spanish March, a buffer zone beyond the Pyrenees, vital for defense against the Caliphate of Cordoba. To get a sense of the scale, consider a map of Europe. Charlemagne's empire was a vast mosaic of dense forests, rushing rivers, fertile plains, and towering mountains. It was a domain that spanned different climates, cultures, and economies. There was no single language, but a cacophony of Germanic tongues, vulgar Latin, and local dialects. The unification, then, was not homogeneous. It was a web of loyalties, of enforced submission, and of a growing Christian identity that Charlemagne sought to impose on all his subjects. Organizing this colossal empire was a monumental challenge. Charlemagne could not be everywhere at once. He ruled through a complex hierarchy of officials and a system of laws. The lands were divided into counties, each governed by a count, comes, appointed directly by the king and responsible for the administration of justice, the collection of taxes, and the local military command. In the border regions, more exposed to invasions, he created the marches: Hispanic March, Saxon March, Bavarian March, governed by marquises, who had greater military autonomy and were responsible for defense and security. To ensure the loyalty and effectiveness of his officials, Charlemagne employed the missi dominici, envoys of the Lord. These were pairs of officials, usually a count and a bishop or abbot, who traveled throughout the empire, inspecting local administration, hearing complaints, ensuring the execution of royal laws, and reporting directly to the emperor. It was a system of control and oversight that demonstrated Charlemagne's concern for maintaining the cohesion of his vast territory and preventing corruption or disobedience. Charlemagne's court was itinerant, but the center of his power was increasingly at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, where he built a magnificent palace complex that rivaled Roman buildings in its ambition and grandeur. Aachen became the administrative, cultural, and in many ways spiritual heart of the empire. It was there that he received ambassadors, met his advisors, and where the Carolingian Renaissance flourished. The economy of the empire was predominantly agrarian, based on land tenure and peasant production. Trade, although present, was largely local or regional. Towns were smaller and less developed than in earlier periods. However, Charlemagne attempted to stimulate the economy by standardizing weights and measures, encouraging the minting of silver coins, and protecting trade routes. The Carolingian Empire was not a modern state with a centralized bureaucracy as we know it. It was a more personal construction, heavily dependent on the figure and energy of Charlemagne. Its vastness and the diversity of its peoples were its greatest strength and, at the same time, its greatest weakness. Maintaining this unity required constant and charismatic leadership, and in 800 AD, this leadership would reach its peak with an event that would forever change the face of Europe and consolidate the rebirth of an idea that seemed to have died with the fall of Rome: the idea of a universal Christian empire. That moment would not only be an act of coronation, but the materialization of an ancient dream. Christmas in 800 AD was no ordinary day on the calendar of history. In Rome, in St. Peter's Basilica, under the watchful eyes of an ecstatic crowd, an event took place that would not only redefine the destiny of Charlemagne, but also the very identity of Western Europe. That day did not just mark the coronation of a king. It symbolized the rebirth of a concept, the Roman Empire, in an entirely new context under the aegis of Christianity. The atmosphere in the basilica was charged with anticipation. Charlemagne, the powerful king of the Franks and Lombards, was in Rome to restore order to the church and, more specifically, to support Pope Leo III. The pontiff had faced serious accusations from his enemies in Rome: perjury, adultery, and even physical violence, having been attacked and nearly blinded, and his tongue cut out. Leo III fled to Charlemagne's court in Paderborn, seeking refuge and support. Charlemagne, seeing the perfect opportunity to consolidate his authority while protecting the head of Christendom, escorted him back to Rome for an investigation. The trial of the Pope, presided over by Charlemagne, ended with the acquittal of Leo III, who swore his innocence. Charlemagne's authority over the affairs of the Church and the papacy was unquestionable. The coronation, however, took many by surprise, including, supposedly, Charlemagne himself. The official version, according to his biographer Einhard, is that Charlemagne was caught off guard. As he knelt to pray at Christmas Mass, Pope Leo III is said to have placed a golden crown on his head. The organized crowd burst into acclamations. "To Charles the Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." It was a scene of pure symbolism and power. The cry, "crowned by God," resounded, legitimizing his ascension not only by human will, but by divine intervention. But what was really going on behind the scenes? Was this coronation a spontaneous act of the Pope or a carefully orchestrated plan? Most historians agree that the coronation was the result of long and complex negotiations. Charlemagne probably knew what was going to happen. If he did feign surprise, it was perhaps to avoid the impression that he was usurping the imperial title, or to ensure that the initiative came from the Pope, strengthening divine legitimacy. He wanted the title, but he did not want it to appear that he had taken it by force from the Church. The political implications of this coronation were monumental. First, it marked the establishment of a new Roman Empire in the West, more than 300 years after the fall of the original empire. This did not mean that Charlemagne saw himself as the direct successor of the pagan Roman emperors, but rather as the heir to a Christian imperial tradition. He was emperor of the Romans, but his empire was Christian, theocratic, and above all, Frankish. Second, the coronation established a complex and sometimes ambiguous relationship between the Pope and the emperor. The Pope crowned the emperor, suggesting that spiritual power was superior to temporal power, and that the emperor's authority came from God, but was mediated through the Church. However, Charlemagne was the one who had protected the Pope, and he was the one who held the real military power. This power dynamic between papacy and empire would be a source of conflict and negotiation for centuries in medieval Europe. Third, the coronation was a direct challenge to the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines considered themselves the sole legitimate heirs to the Roman Empire, and their emperor in Constantinople was the only valid Roman emperor. At the time of Charlemagne's coronation, the Byzantine throne was occupied by the empress, Irene, a woman who had deposed and blinded her own son in order to seize power. For many in the West, the enthronement of a woman was a legal aberration, and the imperial throne was considered vacant. Charlemagne, with his vast territorial expanse and his role as defender of Christianity, seemed the perfect candidate to fill this void. The coronation in Rome, therefore, was an act of declaration of political independence of the West from Constantinople, solidifying the division between the two halves of the former empire. From AD 800 onwards, Charlemagne was known as Charles the Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. This title was not just a decoration. It carried with it the responsibility of protecting the Church, maintaining order in Christendom, and serving as the highest secular authority in Europe. He did not merely rule over a kingdom, he presided over an empire, a vision of order and unity that extended across much of the continent. Christmas of AD 800 was the culmination of his career, the culmination of decades of military conquest and reform. But an empire so vast and personally built needed a center, a beating heart from which to rule. And that heart was being carefully crafted in Aachen, the future capital of his imperial vision. As the glory of the Carolingian Empire spread across the lands of Western Europe, one location in particular began to emerge as Charlemagne's true nerve center, Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle in French. Far from being a traditional capital in the Roman sense, Aachen was the physical embodiment of Charlemagne's ambition, a center of power, culture, and faith that he himself conceived and built. It was the beating heart of his empire, the preferred residence of an emperor who, out of necessity and outspoken habit, remained itinerant, but who saw in Aachen the basis for his grand vision. The choice of Aachen was not random. The city, located in present-day Germany, on the border with Belgium and the Netherlands, had a characteristic that fascinated Charlemagne: its thermal springs. These hot waters, which had already been used by the Romans, were ideal for leisure and health, and Charlemagne, who enjoyed swimming and bathing, made them a central element of his palace complex. In addition, the location was strategic, close to the borders of the Frankish kingdom and the newly conquered Saxon territories, allowing for more effective control. What Charlemagne built in Aachen was not just a palace, but a monumental complex, a veritable new Rome in the north. The project was ambitious, aiming to emulate the grandeur of ancient Rome and, to a lesser extent, Constantinople. Its centerpiece was the Palatine Chapel, a masterpiece of Carolingian architecture and a testament to Charlemagne's vision. Inspired by the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, a Byzantine city in Italy, the Palatine Chapel was octagonal, with a stunning dome and gleaming mosaics. It was not just a place of worship, it was where Charlemagne attended Mass, where he received ambassadors and where, symbolically, his divine power was manifested. The chapel was adorned with marble, bronzes, and columns brought from Rome and Ravenna, a clear sign of his ambition to rival the imperial past and present. Next to the chapel lay the imperial palace, a complex of buildings that included audience halls, royal residences, administrative offices, accommodation for the court and its numerous officials, and even a school. The complex was vast, designed to accommodate not only the imperial family, but also hundreds of nobles, clergy, intellectuals, and warriors who made up Charlemagne's court. It was a vibrant center of political, cultural, and social activity. Court life at Aachen was a fusion of frank military austerity and growing intellectual sophistication. Although Charlemagne was a warrior, he was also a patron of the arts and education, and Aachen became the epicenter of the Carolingian Renaissance. Intellectuals from all over Europe were invited to live and work at the palace, making it a beacon of learning in an age of darkness. The palace library, though modest by modern standards, was a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts, fervently copied and studied. Aachen was not just a center of power, it was a laboratory of ideas and a cultural melting pot. The most important decisions of the empire were made there. Ambassadors from Byzantium, the Caliphate of Baghdad, and distant kingdoms arrived in Aachen, bringing exotic gifts and seeking alliances. The elephant Abul Abbas, sent as a gift by Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of Baghdad, is a testament to the international projection of the power of Charlemagne and his capital. Although Charlemagne spent much of the year traveling throughout his empire, inspecting and pacifying his lands, Aachen was his safe haven, the place where he spent the winter and Easter, and where he concentrated his building and renovation efforts. It was his imperial city, a physical reminder that the Roman Empire had been reborn, not in Rome but in a new center of power in northern Europe, shaped by the vision of a singular leader. After his death, Charlemagne would be buried in Aachen's own Palatine Chapel, a testament to his deep connection to the place he had transformed from a spa settlement into a symbol of his empire. The city and its imposing chapel would remain a tangible legacy of his vision, a monument to his ambition to revive imperial glory, and at the same time a testament to the cultural and intellectual flowering he so encouraged. But what exactly was this Renaissance that he so encouraged, and who were the men who helped shape it? While Charlemagne's sword forged an empire through conquest, his visionary mind saw that lasting power was not built by iron alone, but also by the light of knowledge. In the midst of what many called the Dark Ages, a period of educational and cultural decline following the fall of Rome, Charlemagne ignited a flame that would become known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This was not a rebirth in the eyes full sense of the Italian Renaissance centuries later, but rather a monumental and systematic effort to revitalize education, writing, the arts, and thought throughout his vast empire. He understood that a strong empire required competent administration, and that administration depended on learned men. Charlemagne lamented the decline in the level of Latin and in general culture that had occurred in his time. He noticed that many clergy could barely read the sacred texts in Latin correctly, and that administrative and legal documents were riddled with errors. Liturgical uniformity and the effective administration of the empire required educated clergy and civil servants. His vision was not just of military power, but of an empire where the faith was understood and the law was accurately applied. The heart of the Carolingian Renaissance was educational reform. Charlemagne issued a series of edicts, such as the Admonitio Generalis, 789 AD, which required the establishment of schools in every monastery and bishopric. These schools were not intended solely for the clergy. They were open to talented young men, regardless of their social background. The idea was to form a new generation of literate men who could serve both church and state. He encouraged the study of the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. Manuscript copying was a fundamental pillar of this Renaissance. Monasteries such as Corvey, Tours, Fulda, and Saint-Gall became veritable book factories. Carolingian copyists, under the supervision of scholars, worked tirelessly to preserve the knowledge of classical antiquity and sacred texts. Works by Roman authors such as Virgil, Horace, and Cicero were copied, ensuring that they would not be lost to posterity. In addition, the Bible and liturgical texts were revised and standardized, ensuring the uniformity of faith throughout the empire. This passion for copying was crucial to the transmission of classical knowledge to future generations. One of the most important innovations of this period was the development of Carolingian minuscule. Before this, the script was difficult to read, with mixed upper and lower case letters and no spaces between words. Carolingian minuscule was a clear, legible, and standardized script with well-formed letters and separation between words. This innovation not only made it easier to read and copy manuscripts, but it also became the basis for the text fonts we use today, making it an invisible but lasting legacy. Art and architecture also flourished. Although influenced by Roman and Byzantine models, they developed a distinct style, incorporating Germanic elements. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen is the most notable example of Carolingian architecture, with its magnificence and use of noble materials. The art of the book, with its richly decorated illuminations, also reached a new level, producing true visual gems. To orchestrate this ambitious cultural project, Charlemagne gathered the greatest intellectuals of his time at his court, forming the so-called Palatine Academy. These wise men from different parts of Europe were his advisors, teachers, and collaborators. They debated theological, philosophical, and grammatical questions, and acted as a driving intellectual force for the empire. The presence of these illustrious men at court was a testament to Charlemagne's commitment to scholarship. The Carolingian Renaissance, though short-lived in its intensity after Charlemagne's death, had a profound and lasting impact. It preserved much classical and religious knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. It laid the foundations for the development of education and culture in medieval Europe, influencing the centuries that followed. It created a literate elite that would be crucial to the governance of future kingdoms. Charlemagne did not simply forge an empire by the sword. He shaped it with pen and word, planting the seeds for a future where knowledge would be valued and disseminated. But who were these wise men he assembled, and what was their role in this grand intellectual project? The brilliance of the Carolingian Renaissance was not the result of Charlemagne's will alone. It was the manifestation of the genius and hard work of a select group of intellectuals, poets, theologians, and grammarians whom the emperor gathered at his court, forming what has come to be known as the Palatine Academy. This was not an academy in the modern sense, with buildings and formal courses, but rather a circle of wise men who lived at court, advised the emperor, educated his children, and, crucially, worked tirelessly to revitalize knowledge and culture throughout the empire. Among these brilliant minds, one stands out as the most influential: Alcuin of York. Alcuin, born around 735 AD in Northumbria, present-day England, was a Benedictine monk and one of the greatest scholars of his time. He had been educated at the renowned School of York, one of the few centers of learning that had preserved classical knowledge and teaching traditions amid the turmoil of the Middle Ages. His reputation as a teacher and theologian was vast. Charlemagne met him at Parma in 781 AD and was immediately impressed by his erudition and passion for education. The emperor invited him to join his court at Aachen, an invitation that Alcuin accepted, becoming one of the most influential and trusted figures in the imperial circle. Alcuin was not just a teacher, He was Charlemagne's chief advisor on educational and religious matters. He was the intellectual architect of the Carolingian Renaissance. Under his direction, the Palatine school, the court school, flourished. Students, including Charlemagne's own sons and the empire's young nobles, were taught grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, the trivium, and to a lesser extent, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium. Alcuin not only taught, but also wrote manuals and textbooks that would be used throughout the empire, standardizing teaching and ensuring the quality of instruction. His influence extended beyond the court. Alcuin was instrumental in reforming the scriptoria, manuscript copying places, in monasteries. He oversaw the standardization and revision of religious texts, including the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible, correcting errors and ensuring the purity of the texts. The creation of Carolingian minuscule, the legible standardized script that revolutionized book copying, has been largely attributed to his influence and efforts. But Alcuin was not alone. Charlemagne attracted a constellation of talents from different parts of Europe. Paul the Deacon, a Lombard monk and historian of great renown, author of the History of the Lombards, which provided valuable insights into the history of Italy and the Lombard dynasty. He was a master of Latin and poetry. Einhard, the future biographer of Charlemagne, a Frankish layman educated at the Palatine school. He was an architect and close advisor to the emperor, and his Vita Caroli Magni, Life of Charlemagne, is the main contemporary source on the emperor. Peter of Pisa, an Italian grammarian who taught Latin to Charlemagne and introduced him to classical scholarship. Paul the Deacon, an outspoken theologian and poet. Charles, a Frankish poet and diplomat, son of Charlemagne. These wise men were not mere isolated scholars. They were active members of the imperial court, participating in political discussions, writing letters and official documents, and even accompanying the emperor on his travels. They debated, composed poems, exchanged letters, and helped each other in their studies. Charlemagne himself actively participated in these debates, showing a remarkable interest in intellectual matters. Although he himself had difficulty learning to write fluently, the presence of these men at Charlemagne's court transformed Aachen into an intellectual hub. They brought knowledge from diverse traditions, creating an environment of cultural effervescence and learning. They were the catalysts for the Carolingian Renaissance, ensuring that classical knowledge was not lost, that sacred texts were preserved, and that a new generation of leaders was educated. The legacy of these wise men is immense. They not only helped to consolidate Charlemagne's empire by providing it with a solid intellectual and cultural foundation, but also sowed the seeds for the cultural and educational development of Western Europe in the centuries that followed. Without Alcuin and his colleagues, the Carolingian Renaissance might not have achieved the depth and scope that it did. They were the true guardians and disseminators of light in times that were still struggling to emerge from the shadows. But how was this empire, built with so much strength and intellect, actually governed on a day-to-day basis? Building an empire by sword and faith was a feat, but governing it, maintaining the cohesion of such a vast and diverse territory in an era of slow communications and poor infrastructure, was an even greater challenge. Charlemagne understood that the grandeur of his domain could not be sustained by military strength or imperial prestige alone. He needed a system. Thus, throughout his reign, he implemented a series of administrative reforms that, although rudimentary, by modern standards, were revolutionary for their time, establishing the foundations for more effective and centralized governance. The backbone of Carolingian administration was the division of the empire into counties. Each county was an administrative unit governed by a count, comes, appointed directly by the emperor. The count was not just an administrator, he was Charlemagne's representative in the region, the executive arm of royal power. His responsibilities were vast and crucial. He was responsible for local justice, presided over the courts, collected taxes and duties for the imperial treasury, and crucially, he was the military leader of the region, responsible for raising and leading local troops. on the emperor's behalf. The loyalty of these counts was vital, and Charlemagne made a point of appointing men he trusted, often from his own family or from his network of clients. On the most vulnerable borders of the empire, where external threats were constant, such as the Saxons, Avars, or Moors, Charlemagne created the Marches. These were large border regions, governed by marquises or margraves, who had greater military autonomy and expanded powers for defense. The Hispanic March, for example, protected the empire against Muslim incursions. The marches were true war zones, and their rulers were experienced warriors and administrators, with the prerogative of making quick decisions to protect the imperial territory. But how did Charlemagne ensure that his counts and marquises, spread across a vast territory, were loyal and efficient? The solution was an ingenious system of inspection and supervision, the missi dominici, sent by the Lord. Twice a year, or more often if necessary, Charlemagne sent pairs of officers to inspect the counties. These pairs were usually composed of a layman, a count or duke, and a cleric, a bishop or abbot, ensuring that both secular and religious aspects were inspected. The missi dominici had the authority to hear complaints against local officials, investigate abuses, correct errors, collect information, and ensure that the orders and laws of the emperor, the capitulares, were properly carried out. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, a vital tool for maintaining cohesion and order in a decentralized empire. The capitularies were the decrees and laws that Charlemagne issued regularly. They covered a wide range of subjects, from religious matters and disciplinary matters for the clergy to regulations on land administration, military organization, and justice. These documents were sent to the counts and missi dominici for them to read and implement throughout the empire. The creation and dissemination of these capitularies demonstrate Charlemagne's desire to standardize and unify the legal and administrative system. In addition, Charlemagne reformed the monetary system, standardizing the minting of silver coins, the denarius, throughout the empire, which facilitated trade and tax collection. He also encouraged the construction and maintenance of roads and bridges, which were essential for troop movements and trade, although Roman infrastructure was still far from being fully restored. Charlemagne's court was an administrative center. In its own right, there were officials responsible for the chancellery, document production, the treasury, and ecclesiastical affairs. Although Charlemagne did not have a complex bureaucracy like that of modern empires, he surrounded himself with learned men, many of them clergymen from the Carolingian Renaissance, who assisted him in administration and writing. These reforms were fundamental to the relative stability and prosperity of the Carolingian Empire during Charlemagne's reign. They represented a conscious effort to overcome the fragmentation and administrative inefficiency that characterized post-Roman Europe. The system, while dependent on the energy and charisma of the emperor himself, laid the foundations for future models of medieval governance. Charlemagne did not simply conquer an empire, he made it functional, but this functionality was not limited to the secular. The church was also targeted by his reforms, seeking a renewal that would make it an even more effective partner in his imperial project. For Charlemagne, the strength of his empire was not measured solely by the extent of its borders or the effectiveness of its secular administration. Religious unity was a fundamental pillar, a mortar that would unite the diverse peoples under his crown. For this reason, the renewal of the church during his reign was as far-reaching as his political and military reforms. He aimed not only to protect the Christian faith, but to standardize it, purify it, and transform it into a cohesive and disciplined force capable of serving both the divine purpose and the goals of the empire. It was a vision of a unified Christianity, under his protection, with the church as an indispensable administrative and moral arm. The main driving force behind this renewal was the search for liturgical uniformity. Before Charlemagne, liturgical practices varied considerably from one region to another, even within the Frankish kingdom. There were different rites, chants, and liturgical calendars. Charlemagne, with the support of Pope Hadrian I and Alcuin of York, imposed the Roman rite throughout his empire. This meant that Mass and sacraments would be celebrated in the same way, with the same texts and chants, from Aquitaine to newly conquered Saxony. Copies of the Gregorian Sacramentary, a Roman liturgical book, were distributed and copied on a large scale, replacing local liturgies. This standardization was not just a matter of faith, it was an act of cultural and political unification, ensuring that all his subjects, regardless of their ethnicity, felt part of the same Christian community. Reforming the clergy was another priority. Charlemagne was concerned about the quality and morality of priests and monks. Many were ignorant, some lived licentious lives, and monastic discipline had declined in many communities. He issued capitularies requiring bishops and abbots to strictly supervise their clergy, ensuring that they were educated, lived according to the rules, and preached correct doctrine. He encouraged the founding of new monastic communities and the reform of existing ones, promoting adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, which advocated a life of prayer, work, and study. Monasteries such as Fulda, Saint Gall, and Corvey became centers of monastic scholarship and discipline, serving as models for the entire empire. The education of the clergy was vital to this renewal. Charlemagne realized that an ignorant clergy could not instruct the people or administer effectively. He ordered all cathedrals and monasteries to establish schools to educate not only future clergy, but also lay people. In these schools, Latin was taught so that they could read the sacred texts and the church fathers. The Bible was carefully revised and copies were distributed widely to ensure that God's word was accessible and uniform. The emphasis on reading and writing within the church had a ripple effect throughout the empire. The Carolingian script, Carolingian minuscule, developed during this period, was a crucial innovation that facilitated this standardization. Its clarity and legibility made copying manuscripts faster and less prone to error, allowing for the efficient dissemination of religious and administrative texts. Without this reform in writing, liturgical uniformity and the circulation of knowledge would have been much more difficult. Charlemagne also actively engaged in theological matters, convening councils and synods where doctrines were debated and heresies condemned. He saw himself as the guardian of orthodoxy, a Christian emperor with the responsibility of ensuring the purity of the faith in his domain. His authority over the church in his empire was almost unprecedented, intervening in the appointment of bishops and the administration of ecclesiastical property. This renewal had a profound and lasting impact. It strengthened the Catholic Church as a unified and disciplined institution, making it an even more powerful force in medieval Europe. It helped cement the Christian identity of Western Europe, setting it apart from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. And crucially, it provided Charlemagne with a network of learned and loyal men, the clergy, who could serve as administrators, scribes, and advisors throughout his vast empire. The cross, reformed and strengthened, was now as essential a pillar of the empire as the sword. But behind all this political and religious grandeur was a man, with his own family, his own marriages, and the inevitable question of succession that plagued all monarchs. Behind the image of the warrior emperor and cultural reformer lay a man with a complex personal life, marked by multiple marriages, a large family, and the family intrigues common to medieval courts. Charlemagne's family was not just an aspect of his private life. It was a political tool, a resource for cementing alliances, keeping the peace, and, above all, ensuring the continuity of his newly founded Carolingian dynasty. The question of succession, in particular, was a constant shadow hanging over his reign, a challenge to the stability of an empire built around a single dominant figure. Charlemagne had at least 4 legitimate wives and several concubines, with whom he fathered a large number of sons and daughters. His marriages were most often political arrangements designed to strengthen his position. Himiltruda, his first companion, with whom he had his first son, Pepin the Hunchback. Although not a formalized marriage by later ecclesiastical standards, it was a recognized union, Desiderata, or Ermengarda, daughter of Desiderius, king of the Lombards. This marriage, orchestrated by her mother Bertrada, was intended to establish a Franco-Lombard alliance. However, Charlemagne repudiated her in 71 AD after less than a year, an act that angered his father-in-law and precipitated war with the Lombards. The repudiation demonstrated to Charlemagne that marital alliances were dispensable if they did not serve his broader political goals. Hildegard, his most beloved and influential wife, whom he married in 771 AD. She was a respected figure at court and a close advisor. His death in 783 AD was a significant blow to Charlemagne. Fastrada married her in 784 AD. Fastrada was known for her severity and, according to some accounts, a tyrannical influence. She also bore daughters, Liutgarda, his last wife, whom he married in 794 AD. She had no children, but was loved by Charlemagne, who deeply mourned her death in 800 AD. In addition to these wives, Charlemagne kept several concubines and mistresses, a common practice among Frankish kings and not considered scandalous at the time. He had children with many of them, whom he acknowledged and educated, although he did not consider them in the main line of succession. Among his legitimate children, 3 were particularly important for the question of succession. Charles the younger, Charles II, Hildegard's eldest son, appointed king of Neustria. He was a talented warrior and one of his father's favorites. Pepin of Italy, born Carloman, later renamed Pepin, son of Hildegard. He was named King of Italy. He led important military campaigns, including the conquest of the Avars. Louis the Pious, Hildegard's youngest son, named King of Aquitaine. He was the most educated of the brothers and, although less warlike, was deeply religious. Charlemagne's concern about succession was evident. He had experienced a bitter rivalry with his brother Carloman, who had narrowly avoided dividing the kingdom. To avoid a repeat of this scenario, he attempted to plan a succession that would ensure the continuity of his empire. In 806 AD, he issued the Divisio Regnorum, division of the kingdom, a will that divided his empire among his 3 surviving legitimate sons, Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis the Pious. The idea was that each would rule his own part, but that the empire as a whole would remain united under a kind of suzerainty, with the imperial title probably passing to the eldest son. However, fate intervened again. Whatever the gods or chance had in store for the future would defy all plans. In quick succession, Charles the Younger died in 811 AD, and Pepin of Italy died in 810 AD. Of all his legitimate sons whom he had planned for succession, only one remained alive, Louis the Pious. This series of unexpected deaths forced Charlemagne to reevaluate his plans. In 813 AD at Aachen, he convened a general assembly of nobles and clergy. Before them, Charlemagne proclaimed Louis the Pious as his sole heir and crowned him emperor. It was a planned and legitimized act of succession, unlike his own coronation, which supposedly took him by surprise. This act, while seemingly ensuring continuity, sowed the seeds of future conflict. Charlemagne's family was a microcosm of his empire, vast, complex, and subject to the forces of ambition and destiny. Marital choices, alliances forged and broken, and the tragedy of his children's deaths shaped the issue of succession in ways he could not have foreseen. His death in 814 AD would leave the empire in the hands of a single heir, but the seeds of division had already been sown, and the fate of the great Carolingian Empire was about to enter a new and turbulent chapter. The great empire built by Charlemagne, a colossus forged with the sword and the cross, did not survive intact for long after the death of its founder. The unit was a reflection of the energy and charisma of a single man. When Charlemagne died, in 814 AD, his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, assumed the imperial throne. Louis was a cultured religious man with good intentions, but he lacked his father's toughness and unquestionable authority. He was unable to control the growing tensions among his own children, who, like a Greek tragedy, were destined to tear apart their grandfather's legacy. Louis the Pious had 3 legitimate sons who survived him: Lothair I, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. The Frankish tradition of dividing the inheritance among sons, which Charlemagne had prevented with the death of his other heirs, now returned in full force. Although Louis attempted to plan the succession in order to maintain unity of the empire, his attempts were constantly frustrated by the ambitions of his sons and by court intrigue. The addition of a 4th son, Charles the Bald, from his second marriage, further complicated the situation, generating new territorial and succession disputes. Throughout the reign of Louis the Pious, the 3 brothers fought intermittent wars with each other and with their father. It was a period of instability, shifting alliances and bloody battles that undermined the strength and cohesion of the empire. Barons and clerics were forced to choose sides, and loyalty was a constantly fluctuating currency. The figure of the emperor, previously untouchable, was being shaken by family disputes. When Louis the Pious finally died in 840 AD, the empire was plunged into open civil war between his sons. Lothair the eldest son and heir to the imperial title, claimed supremacy over his brothers, advocating the idea of a single empire under his rule. However, Louis the German and Charles the Bald allied against him, seeking a more equitable division of power. The climax of this conflict was the Battle of Fontenoy in 841 AD, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages, in which the forces of Louis the German and Charles the Bald defeated those of Lothair. Although not decisive, the battle weakened Lothair and forced him to seek negotiations. In 842 AD, Louis the German and Charles the Bald sealed their alliance with the Oaths of Strasbourg, a crucial document written in Latin, Old High German and Old French, a testament to the growing linguistic and cultural divergence of the regions of the empire. Peace was finally achieved in August 843 AD, with the signing of the Treaty of Verdun. This treaty was a watershed in European history, as it divided the vast Carolingian Empire into 3 distinct kingdoms. Western Francia, future France. It fell to Charles the Bald. This region corresponded approximately to Roman Gaul and would become the nucleus of the future Kingdom of France. East Francia, future Germany, attributed to Louis the German. This area encompassed the lands east of the Rhine, including Saxony, Bavaria, and Alemannia, and would be the embryo of the future Holy Roman Empire Lotharingia, or Middle Kingdom, granted to Lothair I, who also retained the imperial title. This strip of land, often called the Middle Belt, stretched from the North Sea through the Netherlands, Belgium, Lorraine, Burgundy, Switzerland, and Italy. It was the most difficult part of the country to govern, as it lacked any geographical or cultural unity, and became a constant battleground between West and East Francia in the following centuries. The imperial title, although retained by Lothair, lost much of its power and significance as the territory became fragmented. The Treaty of Verdun marked the end of the unity of the Carolingian Empire and the beginning of a new phase in European history. It not only laid the geographical and political foundations for the emergence of the nations of France and Germany, but also highlighted the growing cultural and linguistic fragmentation of Western Europe. Charlemagne's dream of a unified Christian empire was not realized in any lasting way. The empire fell apart, but its legacy, the idea of a Christian Europe and the influence of its reforms, would persist for centuries. From Verdun onwards, the continent would become a chessboard with new players and new frontiers. The dust of battlefields and the echo of imperial acclamations may have dissipated more than 1,000 years ago, but Charlemagne's legacy resonates. To this day, a testament to the depth of his impact on the formation of Western Europe. He was not just a king who conquered lands. He was an architect, a visionary who, amid the post-Roman chaos, sowed the seeds for modern European identity, influencing kingship, the church, and the very conception of the state for centuries to come. First, Charlemagne is often called the father of Europe, Pater Europae, and not without reason. Although his empire fell apart after his death, he was the first to unify a vast expanse of the continent under a single authority since the fall of Rome. He gave political, religious, and cultural unity to Western Europe, which was in the process of formation. He created a sense of common identity for the Christian peoples of the West, distinguishing them from the Byzantine Empire to the east and the Islamic world to the south. His vision of a unified Christendom became an enduring, if rarely achieved, ideal. Its influence on European identity is tangible. The Treaty of Verdun, although it divided its empire, laid the geographical foundations for the future France and Germany, nations that would become pillars of modern Europe. The borders drawn, even if for convenience, began to solidify the distinctions that would lead to the development of national identities. Medieval kingship was profoundly shaped by Charlemagne. He elevated the role of the Frankish king to a new level, that of emperor of the Romans. He demonstrated that royal power was not just a matter of lineage, but of military ability, administrative ability, and, crucially, divine support. He established a model of a strong Christian king who ruled not only by right but out of responsibility to God and his people. Later kings, such as Otto I in Germany or the Capetians in France, would look to Charlemagne as an architect of state, a source of legitimacy and an example to be followed. The Catholic Church was also profoundly impacted. Charlemagne not only protected it militarily, but reformed and standardized it. He promoted liturgical uniformity, clerical education, and monastic discipline. The Church, under his patronage, became a more cohesive and effective institution, an essential partner in the governance of the empire. The relationship between imperial and papal power, established at his coronation, though complex, would define the political dynamics of Europe for centuries, with emperors and popes vying for supremacy. The Carolingian Renaissance, despite its relative brevity, was a beacon of light in a time of darkness. It saved and copied countless classical and religious manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. It standardized writing with Carolingian minuscule, facilitating the dissemination of knowledge. It established schools and encouraged education, planting the seeds for the future intellectual effervescence of the Middle Ages. It created a literate elite that would be instrumental in the development of bureaucracy and culture in the centuries to come. Without this effort, classical knowledge would have had a much more difficult road to survival. Eventually, Charlemagne became a legendary figure, a symbol of glory and power in the popular imagination. His achievements and imposing personality were immortalized in epics, songs, and tales. This mythical aura, built up over the centuries, continued to inspire leaders and influence perceptions of what an ideal ruler should be. Charlemagne's empire may not have lasted, but the idea of Europe, the structure of its church, the nature of its kingship, and the preservation of its knowledge were lasting legacies. He was the turning point, the figure who, looking to the glory of Rome and the Christian future, was able, for a brief moment, to stitch together the fragments of a fragmented continent and lay the foundations for the world that was to come. But how did such a great man become a figure so shrouded in myth and song? Every great leader throughout history transcends the confines of reality and establishes himself in the fertile terrain of legend. Charlemagne is no exception. His monumental figure, his epic conquests, and his aura as the protector of Christendom transformed him from a Frankish king into a mythical hero, an exemplary knight, and a symbol of power and justice in the popular imagination of the Middle Ages and beyond. The legends and myths that developed around Charlemagne are as important as the historical facts in understanding his lasting impact. The most famous and influential of these legends is the Song of Roland, La Chanson de Roland, one of the oldest and most important French epic poems, dating from the 11th century. The song tells the story of the Battle of Roncesvalles in 778 AD, a military setback for Charlemagne against the Basques, not the Muslims, as legend would later interpret them, during a retreat from a campaign in the Iberian Peninsula. In reality, The Frankish rearguard, led by a nobleman named Roland Rudland, was ambushed and annihilated. It was a minor incident in the vast sweep of Charlemagne's wars. In legend, however, Roncesvalles becomes a monumental event of Christian heroism and betrayal. Roland is transformed into an idealized nephew of Charlemagne, an unshakable knight who, when he sounds his horn for help, does so with such force that his temples explode. He dies defending the emperor and the faith against a vast horde of Saracens, Muslims, betrayed by Ganelon. Charlemagne, in turn, is portrayed as an elderly and wise but also vengeful emperor who returns to annihilate the infidels. The Song of Roland is not a historical record, but a powerful piece of propaganda. It glorifies the ideal of chivalry, Christian martyrdom, and the struggle against the enemy of the faith, shaping the crusading mentality that would dominate Europe centuries later. It also cemented the image of Charlemagne as a divinely supported Christian leader. Other legends and tales spread, some portraying Charlemagne as a just and wise king who went in disguise among his people to learn their needs. Others presented him as a gigantic warrior, of superhuman strength capable of impossible feats. The very etymology of his name, Charles the Great, Magnus in Latin, contributed to this aura of grandeur. The legend of Charlemagne was also fueled by religious myths. He was seen as a holy emperor, a protector of the church and a model of Christian virtue. Despite his complex personal life and brutal campaigns, his coronation by the Pope in Rome, a real historical event, was elevated to the status of a divinely orchestrated event, sealing his sainthood. He was even canonized as a saint in 1165 AD by Antipope Paschal III, although this canonization was not universally accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. Legends were also intertwined with the Crusades. Charlemagne, the champion of Christianity, against the Muslims, although his campaign in Spain was a setback rather than a glorious victory, as legend suggests, was invoked as a spiritual ancestor of the Crusaders. The Song of Roland was recited to inspire Christian warriors to fight in the Middle East. He became a symbol of reconquest in the Iberian Peninsula and Christian expansion. The Carolingian legend cycle expanded to include a wide range of characters and deeds. The figure of Charlemagne became an archetype of the ideal king, a pious, just, although sometimes cruel, and victorious ruler. This idealized image served to legitimize the authority of later kings, who often tried to associate themselves with his lineage or his deeds. These legends and myths are not mere stories. They reflect the aspirations and values of medieval society: heroism, unshakable faith, loyalty to the overlord, and the fight against the infidel. By transforming Charlemagne into a legendary giant, the Middle Ages created a mirror for its own ideals and dilemmas. The real man, with his complexities and contradictions, gave way to an almost divine figure, a guardian of Christian Europe. And it is this mythical figure, as much as the historical one, that continues to resonate down the centuries, asking the question, how is such an imposing man in history and legend remembered and studied today? 1,200 years have passed since Charlemagne's death, but his figure still looms large over the history of Europe. Far from being merely a historical curiosity, he continues to be the subject of intense study, debate, and at times, appropriation. The way in which Charlemagne is remembered today, and his relevance for understanding Europe in the 21st century, are testament to the depth and complexity of his legacy. First, Charlemagne remains one of the fundamental architects of European identity. The concept of Europe, as a unified yet ever-evolving cultural and political entity, has its roots in the Carolingian vision of a Western Christendom. The territorial divisions established after his death by the Treaty of Verdun are often cited as the birthplace of France and Germany, the two pillars that for centuries were the driving force and sometimes the source of conflict on the continent. To study Charlemagne is, in many ways, to study the birth of Europe as we know it. His figure is a symbol of unification, and for this reason he is often evoked in contexts of European integration. The Charlemagne Prize, Karlspreis, awarded annually in the city of Aachen since 1950, is one of the most prestigious European awards, honoring individuals or institutions that stand out in promoting unity and peace in Europe. This demonstrates how, even in a secularized world, the ideal of unity associated with Charlemagne continues to inspire. In the academic field, Charlemagne is an eternal object of study. Historians, archaeologists, and philologists continue to unravel the mysteries of his reign. The Carolingian Renaissance, in particular, is intensely studied for its importance in the preservation of classical knowledge and in the formation of medieval culture. Carolingian minuscule, as we have already mentioned, is the basis of our modern typography, an invisible legacy, but present in every text we read. However, Charlemagne's image is not without controversy. The Saxon Wars and the massacre of Verdun raise ethical and moral questions about the methods of conquest and forced Christianization. In a world that values religious tolerance and human rights, Charlemagne's actions can be viewed in a more critical light. The debate over whether he was a civilizing barbarian or a religious tyrant continues to rage, reflecting the complexities of judging historical figures through a contemporary lens. Beyond academia, Charlemagne lives on in popular culture. Films, TV series, video games, and historical fiction frequently portray him, though often with dramatic liberties. His armor, his crown, and the image of his knight Roland continue to fascinate. Museums, such as the Treasury of the Palatine, Chapel in Aachen, house artifacts from his time, allowing people to physically connect with his story. Charlemagne's relevance also lies in his ability to make us reflect on the nature of power, leadership, and state-building. He demonstrated how a charismatic and determined figure can shape the destiny of a continent. His story teaches us about the complex interplay between secular and religious power, the importance of education and culture for social cohesion, and the lasting impact of decisions taken at crucial moments. In short, Charlemagne is not just a name in a history book. He is a living figure on the stage of European memory, a beacon of unity, a reminder of the continent's Christian roots, and a ground for debates about cultural appropriation and the complexities of imperial expansion. He continues to challenge us to understand the origins of our world, to question established narratives, and to recognize the seeds of the present planted in the past. His empire may have crumbled, but the idea he represented, that of a united Europe, endures, a silent testament to the fact that even in ruins, some legacies never truly die. The journey through Charlemagne's reign, from the ashes of post-Roman Europe to the great but short-lived Carolingian Empire, reveals a man of epic proportions whose actions reverberated for centuries, shaping the very fabric of Western Europe. He was the warrior emperor who unified vast territories by the sword, the devout defender of the faith who expanded it by the cross, the visionary who lit the flame of knowledge in dark times, and the astute diplomat who moved deftly across the complex chessboard of medieval politics. His legacy, as we have seen, is multifaceted. He is the father of Europe, not because he created nations as we know them, but because he forged a common identity, a sense of belonging among the Christian peoples of the West. He shaped an ideal of empire that would inspire rulers for generations, from Otto to Napoleon. His coronation in 800 AD was not just a ceremonial event. It was the symbolic rebirth of an empire, the declaration that a new era had arrived, an era of strong and centralized Western Christianity, albeit under a new crown. The reforms he implemented, from the administration of counties and missi dominici to the revitalization of education and the church, demonstrate an organizing and pragmatic mind. He understood that the strength of an empire lay not only in military victories, but in its ability to govern, educate, and inspire. The Carolingian Renaissance, with its emphasis on copying manuscripts and establishing schools, was a beacon that helped preserve classical learning and lay the foundation for Europe's future intellectual flourishing. Yet Charlemagne's story is not without its shadows. The brutalities of the Saxon Wars, the forced Christianization, and the massacres that accompanied his military expansion are grim reminders of the price of unification and absolute power. He was a man of his time, and his greatness is inseparable from his harshness. His greatest achievement, the unification of an empire, proved to be the most fragile of his immediate legacies. The Frankish tradition of division among heirs, coupled with the ambitions of his own grandsons, led to the dismemberment of the Carolingian Empire in the Treaty of Verdun. That colossus, built by a giant, collapsed into 3 parts, giving rise to the seeds of the future nations of France and Germany. But the irony of history is that even in its fragmentation, Charlemagne's legacy has endured. The idea of a Christian empire, the influence of his reforms, and the mythical aura of his figure have continued to shape Europe. It forces us to ask, should a great leader be judged solely by his achievements, or also by the means he employs? And how enduring can the work of a single man, even a man of such colossal proportions, be? Charlemagne is ultimately a reminder that history is a winding river, where great deeds mingle with human complexities, and where the seeds of the past flourish or wither in unpredictable ways in the future. His story is an invitation to reflect on the nature of power, the quest for unity, and the eternal dance between human ambition and destiny. And if this saga of an emperor who shaped a continent captivated you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next mysteries.